What is going on, guys? This is Daniel, and allow me to introduce you to St. Joseph's College of Maine. A small college in Standish, Maine, this school is next to a beautiful lake, and they also happen to be on the forefront of modern offensive basketball. Let's get to it. They played Division III basketball, and in the 17-18 season, their offense was mediocre. They scored .87 points per possession, which ranked in the 40th percentile. And when I watched their film, it was clear that they were a normal offense. They brought it up the court, they ran set plays, they'd get into pick and rolls, and here's your typical average possession from them. Not terrible, but not great either. But the very next season, in 18-19, their offensive efficiency skyrocketed. They scored 1.06 points per possession, which ranked in the 99th percentile for Division III basketball. Now, the question is, what changed? How does a team make such a big jump in one season? And here's a hint. It wasn't because of great new additions into their personnel. Their personnel was almost exactly the same. So what did they do? Well, first off, they said no set plays, no pick and rolls, no dribble handoffs, and no pattern offenses. They simply follow a set of principles and move the ball with pace. So before we talk NBA, and we will later, let's dive headfirst into St. Joseph's offense. Principle number one is 5-out spacing, and here's an example where here they have all 5 players outside of the 3-point line as the possession starts, and that brings all 5 defenders out of the lane. This will open up driving lanes, and we see that on this next play. As the ball is passed on top, they essentially have 5-out spacing, which opens up the lane, so when a drive happens, the help is late and it's a layup. So at times, they'll start with all 5 guys outside of the 3-point line, but they'll often have 4 outside of the 3-point line and 1 guy in the dunker spot along the baseline. And to me, this is still 5-out spacing because there is no one in the key. But if you want to call it 4-out, 1 in, I have no complaints. Anyways, let's rewind this possession because we'll start to get a sense of what their offense may look like on a half-court possession. With no set play, the guard can initiate however he'd like. So here he passes it to the wing, he cuts through, and then they're off. They swing the ball, they look to drive, and they play with pace. Again, they start things off with a pass and a cut, and we see the value of their spacing. On the drive, the offensive player doesn't really beat his man, but because none of his teammates are in the key, he has an extra second to gather himself and get off a good shot. Not everyone has to be a good shooter, but they do need to space out accordingly. And you can make the argument that having someone in the dunker spot improves the spacing, because now there isn't 5 guys outside of the 3-point line, there's only 4, which allows for situations like this, where there's great spacing between 2 guys on the perimeter, so when the ball handler drives right here, he doesn't have to worry about the defender 1 pass away swiping down and getting a steal, so with 1 guy in the dunker spot, everyone else on the perimeter can spread out a bit more. Principle number 2 is positionless basketball, and here's a good example. So here we have a cut, and on most teams, the player in the dunker spot would stay in the dunker spot. But St. Joseph's wants everyone to pretty much operate on a wheel. So we have the guy from the corner bumping up to the wing, the man in the dunker spot is heading to the corner, and the man who cut through will fill the dunker position. And they nicely play off of this motion and create an open 3. Now you may be thinking, coach, come on, who really cares? But what I would say is, do we want player movement or do we not want player movement? Because what I see is 1 cut gets 3 guys to move. And not only do they move, none of them cross paths, they stay 15 feet apart, creating the spacing that we know is so valuable. And as I let the clip run, we can see that the guy on top is also moving toward the ball, which turns out to be important as on the skip, now the player can drive middle and have space doing so. Here again we get a cut, and because everyone is positionless and they're changing positions, now we have the cutter along the baseline when the drive happens. Now who should help in this situation? Well, the player guarding the cutter, but because he just guarded a cut, his back is turned to the ball and he's not in position to help on the drive. This is a good example of how movement can confuse defenders. Another way they leveraged positionless basketball is whoever got the rebound, that's who they wanted to push it up the floor. Because now you don't have to waste time with an outlet pass, you can get out and go, and that helped them be a high volume transition team. Again, we see the rebounder will push the ball up the floor, and when you combine this with the fact that they didn't give the defense time by setting up set plays, now you have a dynamic offense that gets up the floor quick. Also, as an aside, I liked how in early offense, they usually got quite wide. So here, for example, the trailer isn't looking to catch a reversal on top, he stays wide, and this gives the ball handler more space, and now they can create a transition opportunity pretty much out of nothing. On to the third principle, which is pass and cut. And we talked about this a bit already, and it's very simple, but it's important because it creates movement and motion. So here they start the possession off by passing to the wing, we get a cut, then there's a fill, and off of that, they play. So this is a very basic concept. You pass, you cut. And how many times in this situation will the passer stand still? All the time. But with this principle, you force players to cut and move, which makes it much tougher on the defense. Now it does have to be noted there is a bit of nuance to this principle. So this is what I mean. We get a pass here and it isn't quite an automatic cut. Because if he cut here and there was also a drive, now the cutter would be getting in the way. So the passer first has to wait a half second to see if there's going to be an immediate drive. Now here the ball handler is clearly not driving, so only then will the cutter cut through. Then on the opposite side of the court, we see the same thing, pass to the corner, and the passer doesn't cut right away, he has to read the ball handler, and here there is a drive, so here the passer simply spaces out, and they end up getting a kick out three. So staying on the topic of movement, principle number 4 is a big one. Move on a drive. And I know St. Joseph's keeps it simple. They tell their players, on a drive to the right, everyone moves right. On a drive to the left, everyone moves left. Making this rule so black and white makes it much easier for players to pick up, and it's also a really good concept, and here we see it in play. On this drive, the player on the wing is sort of in the way at first. His defender can stunt at the ball and get in the way of the ball handler. But because of the rule, on a drive to the left, everyone move left, the player on the wing knows to get to the corner, and this creates better spacing so when the help does come, they can get the kick out three. On this play, the ball handler drives to his right, so everyone moves to their right. We see we have the fill behind option behind him, and because of the space created on top, a shooter can fill to the top where there's a good passing angle and get an open three. And we can see why organized movement is very tough on the defense. So here that shooter started in the corner, and the defender is naturally going to look at the ball. So when the drive happens, all of a sudden he's catching it near the top, and that defender is a bit confused, and we see he starts closing out more to the wing, but then he realizes he has to close out more to the slot, and the result is an open three. It's just very tough to defend. And this rule creates some really clever scenarios, one of which is a backdoor cut from the corner that they got all the time this past season. So here we get a drive to the left, and on the wing, the rule says move to the left. But we see here that there's a guy in the corner, and we don't want these two players to run into each other, but we also want them to stick with the rule. So what happens? The guy in the corner moves left by back cutting toward the basket, and here he gets a layup. Whoa, there you have it, guys. This is just part 1. Part 2 is already up and the link is in the description. And before we go to part 2, I just want to raise this question. Do set plays and pick and rolls really just slow the offense down and give the defense time to rest while the offense sets them up? To me, this is a viable question, and at the very least, it's worth thinking about at the NBA level. What if an NBA team ran no set plays and no pick and rolls and just played off principles? We'd call them crazy. But at the same time, if we told someone 30 years ago that we'd be shooting this many threes now, they'd call us crazy. There's always innovation, and to my eyes, it seems like St. Joseph's is a pioneer.